Ida for telling a waiting room about the encounter I had with a doctor. I am in my mid-30s and have a teen daughter who has been my entire world since the day she was born. Her reserved nature has always been a hallmark of her personality, a sharp contrast to the more outspoken and extroverted children I often see among her peers. Life with her has been a journey of learning and adaptation, especially as I've worked to support her through her challenges with social anxiety. Moving to a new town has added layers of complexity to our lives: new routines, new people, and the inevitable challenge of finding the right support systems, especially something as fundamental as a family doctor. The move itself was exhausting. Boxes, unfamiliar streets, and the constant pressure to ensure my daughter feels at home in an entirely new environment have weighed on me heavily. Her high school transition has been rocky, and I've been trying to be as present as possible to ease her adjustment. However, I know her world isn't limited to school. Ensuring her well-being extends to every facet of her life. This is why finding a family doctor has been one of my top priorities, especially since her anxiety makes navigating healthcare settings particularly daunting. The day we visited this new doctor's office, I woke up early to prepare her for what I knew would be a stressful experience. I made sure her favorite breakfast was ready, checked that we had all the necessary documentation, and left extra time to ensure she didn't feel rushed. We arrived at the clinic, its beige walls and worn-out waiting room chairs doing little to inspire comfort. I could sense her unease as she clutched her phone tightly, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The receptionist was a beacon of kindness in what felt like a sea of tension. She smiled warmly as she checked us in, her tone light and pleasant, which seemed to relax my daughter just a little. That brief moment of relief was interrupted, however, by the reality of healthcare, waiting. I watched the seconds tick by on the wall-mounted clock as my daughter fidgeted in her seat, occasionally glancing at me with a silent plea for reassurance. I offered her a smile and squeezed her hand, silently cursing the long delay but knowing this was a hurdle we had to overcome. When we were finally called back, a nurse led us into a sterile examination room. The routine checks, height, weight, blood pressure were conducted with clinical efficiency, though I could see the effort it took for my daughter to engage. Her answers were clipped, her shoulders hunched slightly as if trying to make herself smaller. The nurse asked if there were any specific concerns, and I briefly mentioned a couple of minor issues before transitioning to the reason for our visit: birth control. This was a conversation I never imagined having so soon, yet it wasn't entirely unexpected. My daughter has always been honest with me about her life, a trust I've worked hard to nurture. When she told me she wanted to explore birth control, my initial reaction was a mix of discomfort and resolve. No parent wants to think about their child growing up so quickly, but I knew it wasn't about me, it was about her safety and autonomy. Coming from a long line of teen parents, I am acutely aware of the challenges that come with unplanned pregnancies. I've made it a point to educate her about safe sex, ensuring she understands the importance of making informed choices. When the doctor entered the room, he greeted us with a professional demeanor, his clipboard in hand as he scanned through her file. He asked a series of routine questions, and I answered where my daughter struggled, filling in the gaps her anxiety left behind. Any mental health concerns? Up to date on vaccines? Any dietary issues? I could feel my daughter's tension growing with each question, her discomfort palpable in the way she avoided eye contact and twisted her fingers together. When he asked if there were any other concerns, I gently brought up the reason for our visit. She's interested in starting birth control, I said carefully, keeping my tone neutral to avoid adding to her discomfort. The doctor raised an eyebrow but didn't comment immediately, instead turning to my daughter with a question that made her visibly stiffen. "Are you sexually active?" he asked, his tone clinical but direct. She hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said softly. He followed up with another question: "What are you currently using for protection?" Her answer was equally quiet: abstinence. There was a brief pause before he chuckled lightly. "Good girl," he said, a comment that made me bristle internally. I forced myself to stay composed, not wanting to escalate my daughter's already frayed nerves. His tone wasn't overtly inappropriate, but it struck a nerve, a subtle dismissal of the complexity of her request. The doctor began explaining the various forms of birth control, his tone shifting to one of authority as he detailed the pros and cons of each option. My daughter listened intently, nodding occasionally, though I could tell she was overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information. He then mentioned the importance of preventive care and suggested a pap smear before proceeding. His reasoning was sound, but I immediately felt a wave of protectiveness rise within me. My daughter's comfort and consent were paramount, and I wasn't sure she was ready for such an invasive procedure, especially given her struggles with anxiety. I turned to her, my voice gentle as I asked, "Are you comfortable with that?" She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the ground as she muttered, "It's fine." But I knew her better than that. I recognized the telltale signs of her anxiety, her stiff posture, her reluctance to meet my gaze. I leaned closer and asked again, this time more quietly, giving her the space to express her true feelings. Once again, she said it was fine, but her voice lacked conviction. The doctor excused himself to allow her to change into a gown, and I took the opportunity to check in with her again. "You don't have to do this if you are not comfortable," I reminded her, but she simply nodded, her expression unreadable. I felt a pang of guilt, wondering if I had inadvertently pressured her by not voicing my own reservations more strongly. When the doctor returned, his next request caught me off guard. He asked me to leave the room. I hesitated, caught between respecting my daughter's privacy and wanting to be there to support her. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He explained it was clinic policy for parents to step out during such procedures unless the child had special needs. The reasoning made sense on the surface, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My daughter's anxiety was a form of special need, even if it didn't fit neatly into the categories the clinic recognized. I glanced at my daughter, searching for any sign of how she felt about my leaving, but her expression remained neutral, her anxiety burying any clear indication of her preferences. I turned back to the doctor and asked if a nurse could be present during the procedure. His reaction was unexpected. He seemed slightly defensive, questioning why I felt that was necessary. "It's a non-invasive procedure," he said, his tone reassuring but firm. "There's no need for a nurse to be present." The back and forth left me feeling increasingly unsettled, and I found myself second-guessing my instincts. I explained that I wanted my daughter to feel as comfortable as possible, suggesting that a female practitioner might be a better option. His response was calm but insistent, "I'm a professional. I see bodies of all ages, ethnicities, and weights. There's nothing sexual or inappropriate about this. It's a simple medical procedure." Despite his reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that my daughter's comfort was being sidelined in favor of protocol. I turned to her once more, asking if she truly felt okay proceeding. She hesitated, then finally admitted she didn't want to go through with it. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough for me to make a decision. I told the doctor we would not be continuing and that she would be getting dressed. The tension in the room was palpable as he noted her decision, his tone professional but tinged with what felt like disapproval. As he left the room, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The experience had left both of us shaken, and I knew it would take time to process everything that had unfolded. The moment my daughter said she was okay with it, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Her voice carried no conviction, her posture slumped, and her gaze locked on the floor as though willing herself invisible. I knew that fine wasn't an expression of comfort but a defense mechanism, a way to avoid further confrontation or stress. Her anxiety had once again overridden her ability to advocate for herself, and I couldn't ignore the protective instinct rising within me. Still, I hesitated. How much of this decision should I step into? This was her body, her experience, but I couldn't shake the sense that she was silently crying out for me to intervene. The doctor, still holding his clipboard, didn't seem to notice her discomfort, or maybe he simply chose to ignore it. His explanation about the necessity of early prevention had been thorough and logical, almost rehearsed, but his demeanor felt off. The faint chuckle at her response to the earlier question lingered in my mind. It wasn't overtly malicious, but it carried a subtle undertone of condescension, as if her abstinence was some naive, fleeting notion. It gnawed at me, especially knowing how hard my daughter worked to navigate social interactions, let alone ones this intimate and vulnerable. When the doctor left the room to allow her to change into a gown, I took the opportunity to lean closer to her. "You really don't have to do this if you don't want to," I whispered, my voice low and steady. Her response was muted, a shrug paired with a faint, unconvincing nod. "I know it's important," she murmured, her words barely audible. I could see her trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. But I also knew that she would rather endure discomfort than assert her boundaries, especially under pressure. She changed into the gown with stiff, robotic movements, the sterile fabric draping awkwardly over her frame. I noticed how she avoided looking in the mirror, a telltale sign of her spiraling self-consciousness. My heart ached as I thought about the sheer vulnerability of her situation, compounded by the weight of her anxiety. When the doctor returned, clipboard in hand, his expression remained neutral, yet the energy in the room shifted. "I'll need you to step out," he said to me, his tone polite but firm, as though it wasn't a request but an expectation. His words hit me like a wall. Step out? The thought of leaving her alone in this moment, with a male doctor performing such a personal procedure, sent a wave of unease washing over me. "Why?" I asked, my voice calm but laced with a protective edge. "It's our clinic's policy," he replied. "For this type of procedure, parents aren't allowed in the room unless the patient has specific medical needs." I glanced at my daughter. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, her head dipped low as though hoping to disappear. She wasn't going to object, not here, not now. But I knew her anxiety itself was a silent, invisible need that often went unnoticed by those who didn't understand her struggles. "I don't think she's comfortable doing this without me here," I said carefully. "Can I at least wait until the nurse comes in?" His expression tightened, and for the first time, I caught a flicker of irritation. "There's no need for a nurse," he said, his tone carrying an undercurrent of impatience. "This is a non-invasive procedure. It's quick and straightforward. I've performed this countless times, and I assure you, there's nothing to worry about." I felt my discomfort grow. Was it truly clinic policy? Why was he so resistant to having another staff member in the room? My own experiences with medical exams came rushing back, and every single one with a male practitioner had involved a nurse's presence, an unspoken safeguard, a layer of accountability. The absence of that here felt glaring. "I'd feel more comfortable if a nurse was present," I said, standing my ground. He sighed, the tension in the room thickening. "I'm a professional," he said evenly, though his patience was clearly wearing thin. "I've been doing this for years. I see bodies of all shapes and sizes every day. There's nothing inappropriate about this." I wasn't accusing him of anything, but his defensiveness only deepened my wariness. I turned to my daughter again, searching her face for any sign of what she truly wanted. Her expression was a mix of resignation and discomfort, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "It's fine, Mom." But it wasn't fine. Every fiber of my being screamed that it wasn't fine. "Actually, no," I said firmly, looking back at the doctor. "She's not comfortable with this, and neither am I. I think we're done here." My words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, his professional demeanor faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned to my daughter and said, "Go ahead and get dressed." The doctor's expression darkened, though he remained composed. "Just so you're aware," he said, his tone clipped, "if she's intending to become sexually active, I'll have to note this in her file. And if she decides to pursue birth control in the future, this procedure will still be required." I bit back a sharp response, instead focusing on my daughter as she quickly changed back into her clothes. The sterile gown fell to the floor, forgotten, and she avoided meeting my eyes as she pulled on her hoodie. I could feel the weight of her embarrassment, the shame she carried for reasons she didn't need to. I wanted to say something to ease her discomfort, but the words wouldn't come. As we left the exam room, I kept my head high, though my mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, guilt, doubt. The receptionist greeted us with the same warm smile as before, but I could barely muster a polite nod in return. My daughter clung to my side as we walked through the waiting area, her steps hurried, her gaze fixed on the floor. And then I saw her, a girl around my daughter's age, sitting in the waiting room with what I assumed was her mother. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the frustration of the entire ordeal boiling over, or maybe it was the protective instinct I couldn't suppress. I turned to the mother, my voice low but firm, and said, "If you're here to see Mr. Dr. and your child wants birth control, just know he won't let you stay in the room." My words weren't loud, but they carried enough weight to draw the attention of a few people nearby. My daughter's face turned crimson, her body tensing as she tugged on my arm. "Mom, let's just go," she whispered, her voice pleading. The other mother looked taken aback, her eyes flickering between me and her daughter as she tried to process my words. I knew I had crossed a line. I knew my outburst would embarrass my daughter, that it wasn't the most constructive way to handle the situation. But I couldn't help myself. The entire experience had felt like a betrayal of trust in the healthcare system, trust in the doctor, and even trust in myself for not advocating more forcefully from the start. As we stepped outside into the crisp air, my daughter's silence was deafening. She wouldn't meet my eyes, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as we walked to the car. The weight of what had just happened settled heavily on my shoulders, and the guilt began to creep in. Had I done the right thing? Had I protected her, or had I overstepped? The answers eluded me, lost in the tangle of emotions that clouded my mind. That night, as I lay awake in bed, the events of the day replayed over and over in my mind. I thought about the doctor's words, his defensiveness, the way my daughter had retreated into herself. I thought about my outburst in the waiting room and the look of mortification on her face. Most of all, I thought about what this meant for our relationship, for the trust we had built over the years, and whether I had somehow damaged it in my attempt to protect her. All I knew was that something had to change. This couldn't be the end of the story. The tension in the room thickened as I stood there, torn between the doctor's reassurances and the instinctual alarm bells ringing in my head. My daughter's body language screamed discomfort, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed downward, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Every ounce of me wanted to pull her from this situation, to shield her from the vulnerability I knew she was too anxious to verbalize. Yet, the doctor's professional authority loomed, his insistence that this was a routine, harmless procedure clashing with the gnawing unease building in my chest. I weighed my words carefully before responding again, my voice steady but firm. "It's not that I'm questioning your professionalism, but I know my daughter. She's not comfortable with this. If a nurse or a female practitioner can't be present, I don't think this is the right time to move forward with the procedure." My words hung in the air, the weight of them unspoken but clear. I wasn't going to bend on this. Tomorrow, I resolved, would be a new day. I would sit down with her, apologize for embarrassing her, and talk through everything that had happened. We would find another doctor, someone who respected her boundaries and made her feel safe. And together, we would navigate the challenges ahead, one step at a time. For now, though, all I could do was hope that she knew how deeply I loved her, even if my actions hadn't shown it in the way she needed most. As the days passed, the events at the clinic lingered in my mind like a persistent shadow. I replayed every detail, every word exchanged, every decision made, wondering if I had done the right thing. The guilt of potentially embarrassing my daughter in the waiting room gnawed at me, but so did the conviction that I had stood up for her when she couldn't fully advocate for herself. It was a confusing storm of emotions: anger at the doctor's rigidness, frustration at the system that allowed such policies, and sadness for the anxiety my daughter had endured. At home, my daughter was distant. She retreated into herself more than usual, her responses short, her time spent in her room growing longer. I could sense her discomfort, not just with what had happened but with me as well. She avoided talking about it, and every time I tried to broach the subject, she would brush me off with a quiet "I'm fine." But I knew she wasn't fine. The distance between us hurt, and it made me question if I had overstepped by speaking out so publicly. My husband, ever the pragmatic one, pointed out that my actions had likely caused my daughter more embarrassment than the doctor ever had. "You're her mom, and you're supposed to protect her, but you also have to let her navigate some of these things on her own," he had said. His words stung, not because they were wrong but because they made me doubt myself even more. Was I being overprotective? Had my instincts to shield her from discomfort done more harm than good? The following weekend, I decided we needed a reset. I invited my daughter out for lunch, just the two of us. She hesitated at first, her usual anxious reluctance creeping in, but eventually, she agreed. We sat in a quiet corner of her favorite cafe, the kind of place where the hum of conversation provided a comforting background noise. She poked at her salad while I nursed a cup of coffee, both of us waiting for the other to speak. "I'm sorry," I finally said, breaking the silence. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you at the clinic. I know you were already uncomfortable, and I think I made things worse by speaking out the way I did. I wasn't trying to make a scene, I just wanted to protect you." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "It's okay," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you were just trying to help. I didn't know what to say. I hate stuff like that. I just wanted it to be over." Her honesty broke my heart. I reached across the table and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know," I said. "And I should have trusted you to tell me what you were comfortable with. I shouldn't have pushed. I'm sorry for that too." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past week hanging between us. Finally, I added, "But I also think we need to find a doctor who makes you feel comfortable. Someone who listens to you and respects your boundaries. What happened at the clinic wasn't okay, and we can do better." She nodded slowly, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of relief in her expression. "Yeah," she said. "I don't want to go back there." And so, we began the search for a new doctor. It wasn't easy finding someone who was both qualified and compassionate, who understood the nuances of treating a patient with severe social anxiety, was no small task. But I was determined to make it happen. I reached out to friends in the area, joined local parenting groups, and scoured reviews online. Eventually, we found a small practice with glowing recommendations for their patient-centered care. The doctor was a woman in her early 50s, described as warm, understanding, and deeply respectful of her patients' autonomy. Our first visit to the new doctor felt worlds apart from the experience we'd had at the previous clinic. The waiting room was cozy and welcoming, and the receptionist greeted us with genuine warmth. When the doctor finally came in, she took the time to introduce herself to my daughter, speaking directly to her and giving her space to respond in her own time. She asked thoughtful questions about her medical history, her mental health, and her concerns about birth control, all without an ounce of judgment or pressure. When the topic of a pap smear came up, the doctor explained its purpose but made it clear that it was entirely my daughter's choice. "You don't need to decide today," she said gently. "If you ever feel ready for it in the future, we can talk about it then. For now, let's focus on finding the best birth control option for you." My daughter visibly relaxed, her shoulders lowering as she nodded. She opted for the pill, a choice the doctor fully supported without requiring any additional procedures. As we left the clinic that day, I could see a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips, a rare but welcome sight. She felt heard, respected, and in control, and that was all I had wanted for her. In the weeks that followed, the tension between us began to ease. Our relationship felt stronger, more open, as though the experience had reshaped the way we communicated. I worked on giving her more space to navigate her own decisions while still being there to support her when she needed me. She, in turn, started opening up more about her struggles, her fears, and even her thoughts on her future. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Looking back, I realized that the ordeal at the first clinic, as upsetting as it was, had been a turning point not just for my daughter but for me as well. It taught me the importance of balancing protection with trust, of listening more and pushing less. It reminded me that advocacy doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes, the quiet support of standing beside someone is enough. I still think about the other mother in the waiting room, the one I spoke to in my fit of frustration. Part of me wonders if she took my words to heart, if she asked the right questions when her turn came. Another part of me hopes that my outburst, however impulsive, might have sparked some awareness. But most of all, I think about my daughter, about her courage, her resilience, and the trust she's placed in me. She's growing into her own person, and while it's not always easy to let go, I'm learning to step back and let her lead. Because at the end of the day, that's what this journey is about, not just protecting her but empowering her. And as I watch her take those steps, tentative but steady, I know we're both exactly where we need to be.